Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we are going to begin talking about the Cold War in the context of Southeast Asia and Vietnam. But first, we need to talk about Kennedy's foreign policy, which mostly took place in Germany and the Caribbean. So here we've got John Kennedy stresses the need in his 1960 election for the U.S. to move forward in the Cold War with vigor and determination. He also argues that we've lost ground during the Cold War. During the Eisenhower administration, he points to the new regime under Fidel Castro in Cuba and the missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. So his first goal is to build up our nation's arms. And so the United States in 1960, we're kind of perceived as losing the Cold War because the Sputnik has just been launched by the Soviets. The Soviets are also developing long-range missiles, which contribute to a missile gap. In 1959-1960, the U-2 incident, where a spy plane, high-altitude spy plane, was shot down over the Soviet Union, and it belonged to the United States. It was doing surveillance, and the events of that are depicted in the 2015 Tom Hanks movie and Steven Spielberg movie called Bridge of Spies. And in 1959, also just 90 miles from Key West, Cuba turns communist, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Eisenhower stresses in his farewell address, because he can't run anymore, he knows Kennedy is going to be president, be cautious in foreign affairs because it's a serious business. He says if we're going to respond massively with all of these constructed nuclear weapons that we have. Well, Kennedy comes and he says we're not just going to win the Cold War through nuclear weapons. With hard work and persistence, we can win the Cold War. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So he wants to build up the nation's armed forces and have a flexible response to events. He doesn't just want to respond massively to everything. He wants us to be flexible. So we also need to be prepared to fight guerrilla warfare around the world and conventional wars. So we need to be able to respond to any type of conflict, not just respond to everything with nuclear weapons. So he also increases funding to the conventional Army and Navy forces as well as our special forces like the Green Berets. He also initiates policies to help the third world. See, with capitalism, it seems that the United States has everything and some parts of the world have nothing. Whereas communism, they treat everybody the same. And the Soviets in their propaganda are pointing this out. So Kennedy starts the Peace Corps, or as he would call it, the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps provides technical, educational, and health to developing countries. And they send American volunteers to the third world countries to help them develop. It's still around today, just celebrated their 50th anniversary. They're very successful. The Alliance for Progress was specifically money set aside to help the Latin Americans who feel resentful toward the United States because they feel that we have too much say in the control over their region. So we give some monetary aid to help build up their industry, agriculture, welfare, and healthcare systems, and it is not successful. Like I said, just south of our shores, Fidel Castro is a Cuban revolutionary. He overthrows the government and institutes a communist regime in 1959. And we don't like that. We don't like having a communist country so close to the United States. So in 1960, President Eisenhower, he liked to use his CIA to overthrow governments. He makes a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. And we would use these a lot of Cubans come to the United States during this time because they don't like communism and they don't like Fidel Castro. He's going to make everybody equal. So middle class and upper class Cubans leave Cuba and come to South Florida, where a lot of Cubans still live today. And so in April 1961, Kennedy is now president, but the Bay of Pigs invasion still takes place. 1,400 Cuban exiles land on the southern coast at what is called Bahia de Cochinos, or the Bay of Pigs, and 25,000 Cuban soldiers and Soviet tanks and reinforcements are there waiting for them. It's a huge disaster. All but 300 of them are killed. So it's a very, very big embarrassment by the Kennedy administration. Even though Eisenhower had planned it, Kennedy takes full blame, and it's a huge embarrassment. The Cuban Missile Crisis. We are using these high-altitude U-2 spy planes to photograph other countries and take surveillance. And we find in Cuba that missile sites are being built by the Soviet Union in Cuba. And so we don't like this. We don't like the ability of Miami could be hit in 2 minutes. You know, it could hit anywhere in the country except Seattle, these missiles that they're putting in. So we have to get them out. We can't invade because then they would fire the missiles. And we can't do nothing because that leaves the missiles there. So it's a very, very delicate situation. And Soviet ships are on their way with more missiles. So Kennedy orders the Navy to prepare a blockade, what we called a quarantine of Cuba. Any ships that were coming, we would board them, inspect them, and if they had missiles, we would turn them around. Khrushchev then secretly reaches out to Kennedy and says that if you remove your missiles from Turkey, see, we have the same thing, a country near the Soviet Union, we have missiles there pointed at the Soviet Union. If we remove our missiles from Turkey, then they would remove their missiles from Cuba if we also pledged not to invade Cuba. But for 13 days, and there's a Kevin Costner movie about this as well called 13 Days, if you want to know all went down, the world lived under the threat of the real threat of nuclear war. And here you can see the effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We remove our missiles, they remove their missiles, we avoid nuclear war. They also put in the hotline system to keep communications open. And so in old movies, you may see the red telephone on the president's desk. That rings directly to Moscow, where Khrushchev would be, and they could talk things out without getting things so heated. And also in 1963, the Soviets, the United States, and Great Britain signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is where basically we're blowing up all these nuclear weapons all over the world, just testing them, and it's getting into the atmosphere and blowing around the world and causing environmental havoc. So this limits nuclear testing to underground. 36 other nations signed it as well, and it's signed in August 1963. Now finally for the Berlin crisis. The Berlin crisis, East Berlin, remember, Berlin is in the middle of East Germany. So East Berlin is the communist capital of East Germany. They are losing skilled workers to West Berlin. People cross over into West Berlin, and then they are technically in West Germany, which is free. Khrushchev wants Kennedy to end his occupation of West Berlin, basically giving Berlin to East Germany. Seems like it would be easier that way, but Kennedy refuses. Tensions boil over, and the Cold War really heats up. Kennedy goes back from this conference in Switzerland and asks Congress to dramatically increase their military spending, and Khrushchev goes back and builds the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall is 110 miles of wall built around West Berlin. And the goal of the Berlin Wall is to keep East Berlin citizens from leaving. It's not to keep West Berlin citizens in West Berlin. It's to keep East Berlin citizens from getting into West Berlin, thereby escaping around the Iron Curtain to the west. It works, and East Berlin refugees were kept out of West Berlin, and it kind of becomes the symbol of the Iron Curtain and communism in Eastern Europe. And because of this, Kennedy sends 1,500 more troops to further occupy West Berlin. And here you can see sort of, it's not, in some places it's just a wall, but in some places it's a security corridor like this. You can sort of see everything that is... There's security guard posts, there's barbed wire, there's chain link fence, and I think about 200 people were shot and killed trying to escape through here or escape over the wall. Here's some real pictures of it, and you can see they've done some artwork. They've pictures of them putting up the wall. There's checkpoints where you can get through. the wall and go from East Berlin to West Berlin if you have the right security clearance. So there's a lot of stuff going on here at the Berlin Wall, and it will become a symbol of communism until it is finally torn down in 1989. That's all I have for you today. Later, in next part of this lesson, we will talk about how Vietnam has to do with the Cold War, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.